You're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled, Human Single Father Farmer Found Alien Twins Tied Up on His Land. What he did next will shock you. HFY. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. The wind rose from the north like something waking, a long breath over the wheat and the broken fence lines and the hollow bones of last year's scarecrows. It carried the bite of ozone, a taste of burnt coins on the tongue, and a hum that didn't belong to weather. Ethan Cole paused on the porch with the old shotgun slung low and the old ache sitting high between his ribs. The sky in Kansas is wide enough to hold God and thunder and failed prayers. Tonight it held a bruise. It pulsed along the horizon as if someone had pressed a giant heartbeat against the world. He looked back once through the open doorway, where lamplight turned the kitchen to warm gold and his daughter slept at the table, cheek on a geography book, pencil still in her hand. June was 10 and fierce and always hungry for answers and for the last ripe tomatoes, and for stories about the mother whose laugh she barely remembered except in old recordings. Ethan lowered the lamp wick, tucked a blanket over June's shoulders, and pulled the door shut behind him, letting the night claim him. His boots felt the ground the way a soldier's boots remember everything they've crossed: wet jungle boards, dusted ship decks, ice-locked rock where you light fires that make smoke in colors the earth never makes. He let the gate close with a touch that betrayed the years he had spent learning to move soundless. He still moved that way now because it had saved his life often enough to be habit. And as he crossed the field, he scolded himself, not for going, but for the tremor in his left hand that came whenever the sky was wrong. He should have called someone. There was no one to call. He reached the swell of land we call a hill here and saw the grass pinned down in a circle as if hammered by a giant's palm. In the center of it lay heat, a small trembling of air that made everything around it look like water. The hum quivered through his teeth. He stepped closer carefully, the shotgun loose in his grip, and the heat peeled back the way a curtain might peel from a window. Behind it were shapes. They were small. He thought at first they were trapped animals, deer or coyotes tangled in some illegal snare. He knelt and felt the temperature jump from cool night to fever. And then he saw the ropes were not rope at all, but strands of something alive, clear and fibrous, pulsing faint blue, tightened in loops across narrow torsos and delicate wrists. The first figure's eyes were open and enormous, afraid. The second lay with mouth parted, breath so shallow it might have been prayer. They were not human. Ethan set the shotgun in the grass. He drew out the knife with the dull green handle that had ridden his belt through 2 deployments off-world, and one return he never spoke about. He sawed until the strands hissed and split and curled back like salted slugs. The first child, yes, a child, there was no other word, jerked as the last loop around their chest gave way. The second didn't move. Ethan slid arms beneath bones lighter than they should be and lifted. Their skin was cool, the way creek stones are cool. What passed for veins shone faintly like luminous wire. He carried them up the hill and down the other side and through the back door into the kitchen, past the hanging ladles and June's drawings of meteors and the list on the wall that said, milk, twine, screws, courage. He laid the children on quilts near the stove and wrapped them in blankets that had belonged to June's mother. He heated water. He got the first aid kit he had never managed to let run down. June woke when he was cutting the shimmering residue from the second child's ankle. "Daddy," she said. It was the word that had rescued him 1,000 times from silence. She pushed curls out of her eyes and blinked at the shapes on the floor. "What are they?" He met her eyes because he had promised himself he always would. "They're lost," he said, "and hurt. That's enough for now." The first child focused on June with a kind of wonder, as if seeing something impossible. Their pupils adjusted like liquid. They reached a trembling hand and touched the fringe of the blanket. June crawled closer until Ethan made a small sound in his throat, and then she stopped and sat cross-legged and watched, chin on fists, a soldier in pajama pants. The night softened into hours. He cleaned burns with boiled water and cut free those living cords, which reacted by dissolving into a dust that smelled like hot pine sap. He wrapped wounds. He changed the stove's hatch to lower the wood gently. He tried to remember if he had ever registered with the state that he was an off-world veteran. He tried to remember whether such a registry still existed. He could not remember. At dawn, the first child stirred like a small bird. They blinked, and then their gaze became still the way water becomes still after you drop a pebble, and the rings widen, wider. Ethan felt something move through him, not words but shapes. A burning corridor, gloved hands, a door that won't yield, and the sickening tug of a ship slamming from faster than light back into bruised reality. He swallowed and nodded and said quietly, "I see." "Did they talk?" June whispered, wide-eyed. He shook his head. "They showed." The second child finally drew a deep breath that shivered all through the small body. A sound scraped their throat, a music not meant for air this dense. The first child placed both hands lightly on Ethan's wrist as if to anchor themselves, and then drew one finger in a slow arc on the wooden floor. Where the finger passed, light scored the wood, a symbol like an eye closing on a horizon. "What is it?" June asked. "It means running," Ethan said softly, because in some old language of soldiers and hunted things the sign had that shape. "It means something behind you that doesn't get tired. There are two kinds of times in a life. The kind when you think and the kind when you move." Ethan moved. He set June to watch with a bowl of water and a rag, and the stern instructions a father gives when he wants to say "you are my world" without making her cry. He went to the barn and unrolled the heavy tarp that had been his secret shame and his insurance policy. Under it lay pieces of a past he had told no one about: coils and capacitors, a salvaged rail assembly from a scrapped agri-defense rig, 3 drone frames he had built from orchard sprayers and memory, and a box marked with a symbol nobody used anymore, unless they were serious about staying alive. He turned on the generator he had tuned to drink sunlight and whisper. He checked lines and connections, and the thick cable that ran into the house like an extra vein. He lifted the rifle he had built from an old receiver, and a barrel someone had smuggled out of a black market in Nevada. It felt heavy and good. He carried it to the porch and set it beside the rocking chair, where June's mother had nursed June the week before a fever took her in the space between a breath and the next. Back inside, he found June matter-of-factly sponging the second child's forehead, while the first watched her fingers as if they were stars. "They need names," June announced without looking up. "Everyone needs a name." Ethan, who had delayed for months naming the new calf because the cow had eyes like his wife's, nodded. "You ask them." June pointed to the first child. "You're Lyra," she said without hesitation, and then to the second. "And you're Seth." She looked to her father. "Okay." The first child touched their chest, the movement delicate, and then looked at the second and made a sound that had the crackle of auroras in it. The second child smiled. There was no mistaking the shape even on a face not built for human smiles, and whispered the name back, "Seth." The voice was thin, the voice was brave. They stayed. It was not a decision in the same way no one decides whether or not they breathe. The sun came up and it was the 4 of them now. Ethan set up cots near the stove. He moved the table so the children had more room. He taught them to hold water cups with both hands. He learned that their skin displayed colors the way fields display wind. A flicker of silver when they were curious, a deepening blue when they were tired, a faint pearly glow when they were warm and safe. June showed them the evening chores with a crispness that made Ethan's heart crack a little, because he heard in it not a child playing at adulthood, but a child who had watched adults fall away, and had decided to build a bridge with her small bare hands. Lyra watched June as if memorizing each step for some exam the universe would spring later. Seth touched the pump handle and tilted his head, and then the pump, which had needed 3 hard strokes every evening for a year to prime, whispered water as if it had decided to be generous. "What did you do?" June asked, delighted. Seth shrugged a little and looked to Lyra. Lyra lifted a hand and drew a line in the dust with a fingertip, leaving behind a faint light that repeated the treble clang of something like, "No, not electricity exactly." Ethan crouched, fascinated despite himself. Their energy sang. The farm listened. That first week the sky behaved. He took the radio up to the highest point of the roof every night and called quietly into the noise. "Coal Farm, Sector 9B, any friendly, copy." The old channels answered with static and trumpet ghosts, fragments of once military codes, a few local talkers complaining about supply routes, one woman in Missouri telling a story about a light over the river that had opened like a flower and vanished as if embarrassed by its own beauty. No one answered with the kind of certainty he needed to hear. "We see you. We're coming." He turned the dial and listened and stayed on the roof until the stars grew stomachs and rolled toward dawn. On the 8th night he heard the hum return. It crept along the bones first, and then along fence wire and window frames. The wheat flattened not with wind but with pressure. The clouds did not move so much as they unstitched along a seam you could not find again. June stood on the porch with the lantern unlit and her jaw tight. Lyra pressed both hands against the porch rail, as if ready to lift the entire house and carry it somewhere the sky could not follow. Seth stood between the two of them like a nail holding plank to beam. The first ship descended on the far field. It had no seams. It did not displace air so much as suggest to air that it had always been there, and air had simply forgotten to notice. Its hull absorbed night and returned wrong shadows. Ethan lifted the rifle and did not fire because he had learned young that the first shot is a conversation, and you should decide what you want to say before you open your mouth. The ship's lower arc shifted, and a door opened like a pupil dilating. They came down in armor that moved. The armor was like oil trying to decide whether to be solid. It reflected everything and nothing at once. Their faces were narrow and long and arranged for tasting fear in the air. Their eyes were not eyes, they were instruments. When the first of them spoke, the voice arrived in his radio in his teeth and through the boards of the porch in equal measure. "Human, return fugitives, you will be spared." June's hand found Ethan's elbow and squeezed 1 beat, 2 beat, 3 beat. The rhythm she had used when she was small to say "I'm here" without words. Lyra stiffened as if struck by a forgotten pain. Seth's glow deepened until the air above his shoulders shivered. Ethan thought about the day in orbit over Ypres Station, when his commanding officer had said something like that into a channel. "Surrender the refugees and we will spare the transport." He remembered the lights that followed, the way the survivors had looked at him afterward with a kind of complicated kindness that hollowed him out. He looked at the twins he had not known a week ago and felt the shape of his choice settle around him like his own coat. He thumbed the radio. No. Silence came down with a weight that had temperature and texture, the texture of polished stone. Then the ground 10 yards beyond the porch exploded into a flower of white, throwing dirt as far as the barn. Ethan shoved June through the door and vaulted the railing and rolled into scarred earth that still smelled like summer. He came up into a crouch, swung the rifle, and put 3 shots through the nearest instrument tie. The armor splintered around the hole with a sound like ice catching. The creature dropped without flare, the way a marionette drops when the person holding it remembers they have somewhere else to be. The others moved. The fight was not firefight. It was weather. The creature's weapons did not fire. They altered. A beam of not quite light skimmed the ground, and where it passed, the soil slicked to obsidian glass, trapping feet and reflecting fire. One of the drones he had launched sprang too late and vaporized without smoke. He triggered the line of charges buried along the old fence and watched the shockwave chew their formation and spit pieces of humming armor into the wheat. June pulled cartridges, her small hands steady in the beautiful way hands are steady when they do what they have seen 100 times only ever done by someone else. She braced the back door with a chair, and then, on some old childhood instinct, moved the jar of sugar from the edge of the shelf to the center so it would not fall. Lyra bent double, hands flat on the floorboards, and Ethan felt pressure roll outward from her body in a sphere that cracked windows and made his teeth threaten to leave him. Two of the armored figures staggered as if stepping into an old men's night at a backcountry bar when the floor dips and nobody has repaired it since the 4th of July 3 years ago. Seth lay prone like a mechanic listening to a sick engine and whispered patterns into the wood. The generator hummed. The house threw its own shadow open-mouthed and swallowed one of the attackers whole. The ship studied. The ship adjusted. A panel opened on its hull that was not a panel until it needed to be, and a device emerged like a thorn. Ethan had never seen it before. He did not have to. Every soldier knows when a thing exists to erase. He yelled something wordless. June looked at him and looked at the twins and did not run. Lyra looked up the way a swimmer looks up at the surface before the last dive. She raised her hands and shook. The air tore without noise. Things that should have been happening far away happened here. The pressure built until Ethan's ears filled with ocean. He tried to stand and could not. And then all at once there was no pressure at all. There was just relief so intense it became a cousin of pain. The thorn device burst like a shrimp shell in a skillet, flipping molten. The ship's hull rippled with a frantic, disgusted shudder. The armored soldiers stalled mid-step like insects pinned in a collector's box. Lyra collapsed. Seth caught her and hissed a note that was apology and compliment and warning. Ethan gathered them, both of them and his daughter, and a country's worth of hope, and tumbled through the cellar door as the ship regained its balance and the world above open teeth. The bombardment lasted long enough for June to sleep with her head on his thigh and wake with a start and then sleep again. The cellar smelled like dirt and apples and the old sweat of a man who had once thought he could carry his wife out of a dying body by sheer will. The beams creaked. Poured concrete hummed mild. The generator flickered. Lyra's skin glowed a bruised violet, and Seth breathed in time with the slow clock on the shelf that had belonged to his father and his father's father. At last the night went quiet in that particular way the world goes quiet when something that has not lost now knows it will not win easily. Ethan lifted the hatch with the caution of a fox and stared at a sky as innocent as a newborn. The house had lost its porch. The barn had lost its west wall. The wheat had lost its name and was now a blackened map of a place he had used to live. The ship was gone. Armored bodies lay on the field like punctuation. He stood until the stillness began to bite. He went back down. "It's dawn," he said. "We have a day." A day became days. Words slunk up through old lines. Folks out west had seen shapes in the clouds. A town near the river had woken to the strange silence that means a lot of machines have died at once. Something in the upper sky was eating satellites by taste. The government, what passed for a government now, had no statement that meant more than the wind. There were pockets of readiness, pockets of old anger, pockets of simple stubbornness. Ethan talked to men and women with calluses and to kids who could strip an engine in under 10 minutes because they had never known a world that wasn't trying to stop them from going anywhere. He trained neighbors the way you teach someone to love stubbornly, by example first and words second. He taught them to move in the dark without turning their ankles. He taught them to reload by counting each breath. He taught them to keep their heads when the sky tries to make them put them down. He told them what every veteran tells the next set of fools who will survive because someone taught them to be fools with discipline. We don't win by looking like them. We win by being us longer than they expected. Lyra watched. Seth tinkered. When Seth looked at the generator made a sound of courtship and worked better. When he looked at the water purifier, it purified not only water but also silence. The quiet that came after became less filled with waiting. Lyra's strength came back like winter sun, late and slow and more precious because of all the cold around it. She walked the scorched fields with June and touched her fingers to the damaged earth and listened the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. "It remembers," she said one evening in a voice that startled Ethan with its steadiness. "Your soil remembers rain." June nodded solemnly as if taking a prescription. "Then we'll give it rain. We make rain," Seth asked, amused. June shrugged. "We pray, we irrigate, we steal rain from places that waste it. We are human." She stopped, thought, looked at them. "We're family." Lyra flinched and blinked hard. The color down her shoulders went all soft as dawn. They made a plan that had no capital letters. A grid of farms and towns that had once minded their own business turned into a web whose strands hummed with watchfulness. They used attic antennas and old ham rigs and a rumor that grew legs faster than facts. They shared out the drones and the old defense rigs that had not been melted into tractors. The elders told stories to kids about how not to panic, which is an art. The children taught the elders how to get a camera to lie convincingly, which is another art. People changed the way they stood when the wind came from the north. People laughed more loudly because laughter always sounds better when someone is trying to make it stop. On a night stitched to the next by bugsong and fence wire, Lyra woke choking. She rolled to her side on the cot and gasped. Ethan sat up instantly. June did too, small hand on Lyra's shoulder. Seth was already standing, gaze fixed on a spot 40 miles away and 3 miles up. "They map us now," he whispered. "They send a name." "What name?" June asked. Seth swallowed, a gesture he had learned for this world. "Sovereign." Ethan did not need the translation. He had heard that word used by people who meant it and by others who used it to hide what they meant. He stood. He put on his coat, not because he was cold, but because it had weight and he wanted that weight. He checked the battery on the long rifle with fingers that could still field strip anything with a trigger under the kind of pressure you get when someone is throwing rocks at your head professionally. He looked at June, and then away because every time he looked too long lately it hurt. "We'll make them a different map," he said. By week's end the sovereign ships drifted beyond cloud lines, so clean and careful you would think they were shy. They sent scouts that threaded the silence between houses and learned how we park our trucks. They drank our heat and learned our power grids by smell. They touched the edges of towns and took little pieces no one would miss that night: traffic lights, a steeple bell, a mailbox full of letters, a man write to a woman he would never pose to because she was now more salt than language. They were good. They were practiced. They were not used to running into people who remembered what losing looked like and had decided to hate it. A man named Vargas across the river set up a light kite on his silo that turned every sovereign drone within a mile into a lost child trying to remember its address. A retired teacher named Whitaker ran an underground of teenagers who put paint on road signs at night. Tiniest fleck of crystalline reflective that changed ship LiDAR returns by a hair, so that machines looking for cardinal points ended up circling Goose Road. 4 extra minutes smelling their own confusion. An old indigenous woman in the hills placed carved stakes along the valley edges, and nothing would grow where they were planted, except the plants she asked for. Every night her plants grew into a chorus and sang to the gears in sovereign weapons and made them doubt themselves. Lyra cried the first time she heard the valley sing. Seth grinned and taught the song a counterpoint that made machines dance in place. Ethan found his way back to being something like what he had been. He slept 4 hours out of 24 and pretended that was on purpose. He took his radio and the truck and the rifle and the dog that had just decided she was his to worry about. And he stretched that worry across every lane and ditch and culvert for 100 miles. He learned the smell of an ambush again. He learned again the way men look at you when you ask them to not die, and they agree. He learned again how much boys want to be men, and how much men want to tell them to please be boys one more day. He watched June learn to write names in a little book, and he knew those names would outnumber anyone's reasonable prayers. He did not ask her to stop. He brought her pencils. The first full strike hit far east, deep in city bones. Cameras captured the ships easing out of the clouds like cautious gods, then opening the bottoms of themselves and letting down nets. The nets were made of nothing humans had named yet. They tasted every kind of current, electrical, emotional, meteorological. They gathered, they lifted. They took what they wanted from the air and the ground and the terror. When the nets pulled back into the ships, pieces of the city were missing. Who measured what? The news told us casualties. The old told us omens. After that, days did not so much pass as sharpen. The sovereign did not talk to us again at first. They did not warn. It is a kind of clean cruelty to not even consider whether the things screaming beneath you have a language. The first message the sovereign understood from us that we were still allowed to send was an absence. A ship that did not return to its flight plan. A farmer outside Omaha had built a tether from harvested lightning and a thrifted spool of superconductive cable. He threw his tether at the exact second the ship slid overhead, and he whispered to it the way you whisper to horses. Easy, easy. The ship stuttered like a two-step dancer, remembering that they were born with 2 left feet. It staggered sidewise into the fields and crushed 6 acres of old corn to a mark that would be visible from orbit as long as seasons bothered to come back. The farmer died walking toward it with his arms out. People who watched such things said the ship shook as if it had decided to remember something about gravity. The story walked across counties on legs quick and thin. Lyra listened like a student. Seth listened like an engineer. Ethan listened like a father and then rose from the table and went to the barn and checked inventories. Later, the sovereign spoke. They spoke through the radios of churches and through the steel in the bridges and through the itch that came into your fillings if you had a mouthful of old silver. Return property, they said. Surrender fugitives. Survey will end. Harvest will cease. They sounded like the kind of thing that wears a mask of reason because they are not troubled by the mirror. June set her pencil down like a gavel. They mean Lyra and Seth, she said, not asking. Lyra's shoulders tightened without moving. Seth's glow went dull at the edges like a light bulb in a storm. Ethan watched June's face and felt 100 small griefs and 100 big joys cross his heart like geese in wedge formation. We could run, he said. He had not said the words aloud yet. They tasted like a bad plan he nonetheless wanted to try if she would let him. We could take the twins further west, into the salt flats, into the pipe maze under the old reactors, onto a freight that does not stop until sunset 4 days from now. June's eyes stayed on him. We don't run, she said. Not from bullies. She looked at Lyra and Seth as if she were deciding whether to let them into her clubhouse, and finding that they had already built the clubhouse when she wasn't looking. We make them tired of looking at us. Lyra's breath stuttered and then steadied. She reached across the table for June's hand and June did not flinch. Seth laid his palm flat near Ethan's wrist and Ethan felt a small clean pulse that meant thanks, and also, I am here when doors break. The day the sovereign came in force broke like a horror film and proceeded like a ballet. The sky above the plains filled with objects so black they made the rest of the world look bleached. The objects did not cast shadows. They sucked brightness. People looked up and their pupils did not adjust quite right and they felt sick. The ships did not all descend. Many hung back like supervisors. The ones that came down spread over fields and wind farms and the bones of dead malls. They unfurled throat flowers full of net and smell and calibrations. Someone in the city cried out angels, and someone else said very softly that angels listen and these do not. Across the valley, Whitaker's teenagers took the drone the kids had named Betty into the air with a payload of hope and nails. Across the river, Vargas lit his kite and whispered to the sky in Spanish so ancient it sounded like thunder. Ethan stood in the field that had been wheat and was now a blackboard. He breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth through a cloth drenched in vinegar, because that is what his grandmother had told him to do when smoke made the sky look like God was telling a bad joke. June stood beside him in a baseball cap pulled down low over her eyes. Lyra stood in front of them, legs slightly apart the way June stood when she was about to take a punch and refused to fall. Seth knelt with his hands on the earth, and the earth answered with a tremble that was not fear. The first net fell. It did not look like anything not living could look. It had corners and curves and a kind of hunger like bright fish below a dock at noon. It reached for Lyra and Seth, and for the human shapes near them, as if to take everything into a single mouth and ask questions later of what it had not chewed. Lyra did something with her hands that made the air remember it was a medium and not a floor. The net hit her gesture like a door you forgot you closed. It flared, it faltered, it leaped again. Seth slammed his palms deeper into the soil and murmured a string of notes that remembered rivers. The ground woke. The net snagged on the skin of the world and then tore itself to ribbons in the act of freeing itself again. The second net fell faster. The third fell smart. The fourth fell angry. Lyra met them in a dance that stole her breath and gave it back wrong. She pulled light through her veins until her bones shone. She shook raw. She lifted her arms and parted something less obedient than sea. She broke the day into 1,000 small days and kept dawn for herself and gave noon to Seth. Around them, the world became battle and prayer. Men who had sworn never to lift a gun again after the last war raised old rifles and counted with their teeth. Women who had spent years arguing at school board meetings about the right to teach certain books now ducked behind hay bales and whispered instructions for tracking arcs when something hasn't got gravity so much as suggestion. Youths in hoodies stuck magnets to things where magnets should not stick. A grandmother in braids laid a palm on a sovereign thorn device and taught it the word for apology and the device, understanding suddenly that it had never learned to say it, shut itself like a clam and would not open again. The barn wall, repaired with more patch than original, took a beam meant for a boy and held it long enough for Vargas to attach his tether and yank that beam's parent weapon off its mount like a mean tooth yanked from a mean mouth. The ship in the center saw. It dropped lower. It changed shape in a way brains do not like to watch, as if trying on suits. It expatriated itself from grace. It opened a seam and reached for something beyond weaponry. Ethan felt it before he saw it, the way the world feels when there is going to be an earthquake, and also the way a conversation feels when someone is about to say the thing they think will end argument forever. Seth whispered, a small boy praying in a language that built cities. Lyra, he said, and he tilted his head back and let a note climb his throat. Lyra raised her arms, slow, deliberate, like a woman lifting the last bar of a very heavy song. She took the note from him and split it into harmonics so fine you could thread them through a needle and the needle would not notice. She bent them into a net of her own. It floated above her hands and the air throbbed. Seth's palms sank deeper. The field heaved. They threw their net. It was not a net of capture. It was a net of refusal. The ship seemed closed around it as if swallowing truth and then trembled. The sky wobbled and went briefly full of 2 suns and no shadows and the taste of winter. Then the ship's belly blew out without a sound, the way a soap bubble pops when heat is right. For 1 second you could see its insides, turning machines twisting like sea creatures startled by a flashlight. For 1 second you could see a shape inside the ship that might have been a person once, stretched too long and taught to love the wrong light. Then everything went white and then blue and then dim. Ethan woke with his face in dirt. He tasted iron. He rolled and pressed up and the world swam and then slotted itself. The ship was gone. The upper sky held only a stain like memory. The ground under him was glass cool as if it had decided to be a lake for a day. Around him lay shapes, men and women breathing and not breathing. He found June first because he had learned to find her even in sleep when she shifted away from nightmares. She was alive. She sucked in a breath and made a face and then grinned painfully, and that grin slayed him a little and made him stand. He found Lyra and Seth by following a feeling in his chest that had no compass points. He found two prints in the cooling soil, two oval marks gently luminous as if frost had decided to glow. He found no bodies and no ashes and no drift. He sank to his knees. He put his hand flat on one print and it was warm, the way the top of a child's head is warm when they lean in while you talk. He pressed his forehead to the ground not because he had decided to pray but because he found himself praying by accident, looking for the pieces of hope that had collected around this place and did not want to leave. A cry went up. People were pointing. The farther ships were withdrawing, indifferent as cats. The nearer ships were gone or stingy with their remains. The air smelled like a power station and a thunderstorm and a hospital. June took his hand and squeezed hard and looked toward the field as the sun finally got brave and climbed into the center of the sky. For a brief gasp of time, the two prints glowed brighter, like eyes meeting across a room. Then they faded, leaving only the marks and in his chest, a space that hurt with gratitude and a terror he would not name aloud. The world did not end that day. It did the thing it always does. It rattled forward like a train that needs a new wheel. The sovereign did not return in that number. They chose elsewhere to be obscene. They returned in smaller sips, in careful glances. They learned to do without their nets in our skies. They stopped sending down the kind of soldiers that die in wheat and started listening through crows and rattlesnakes and the small electric hum in your house when you are alone and do not trust yourself to not think of terrible possibilities. The sovereign are old. Old things do not take their hands off your throat after the first time you teach them pain. Old things bide and nibble. So we learned to make nibbling unpleasant. The seasons came back ragged and grinning. Summer, who had always been greedy here, returned with more modesty. Rain nudged the fields with hesitant knuckles and then remembered how to stroke the grass properly. June learned how to run a meeting where half the people present had lost someone and wanted to see blood right now, and the other half had lost someone and wanted to plant trees right now. And she learned how to make both groups feel seen and both leave with a job. She became not exactly a mayor, and not exactly a general, and not exactly a rumor, but part of all three. A braid of those jobs that suits people who do not like being named too precisely, because it makes it easier for enemies. Ethan got older the way a tree does. On the outside, nothing is happening, and inside rings are quietly being drawn. He mended the barn with lumber carved from the last of the old fence. He left the mark of the blast in the kitchen floor, the place where Lyra's finger had written running. He took the radio out on the porch for old time's sake and for new ones. He talked to men in Tennessee who taught crows to ferry wires between hills and to women in Nigeria who had figured out how to braid human hair in a way that made a net that could catch the breath of a drone. He asked nothing. He learned everything. He slept some nights without hearing any sounds that were not there. One winter night, a light came down not from sovereign ships but from somewhere above them. This was not a bruise. It was a lantern. It stopped just above the field where the two prints remained, more visible in frost than in seed. The light hovered while June and Ethan walked out bundled in the coats that had known all the winters of their lives. They stood with the cold on their cheeks, and the light lowered to a soft height and opened like the shell of a nut, and the smell that came from it made Ethan want to cry, because it smelled like a kitchen he had never been in but had loved as a child. A shape stepped out, tall, wrapped in fabrics that moved like grass in water, face veiled with something that did not hide the eyes, which glowed such a gentle gold it made the moon look cruel. The shape bowed slightly and then bent more and touched the ground where the prints were with the palm of a hand that looked delicate and was not. The shape looked up at them and spoke in a voice like cards being shuffled by someone who loves the game. On that day, the being said, out where the ships thought themselves alone with your fear, 2 children chose a different ending. They were taken up and welcomed. They are cared for. June's breath turned white in the light. Can we see them? The being's head lifted as if listening to someone behind them, someone the size of a hill. One day, they said, and it was not a lie and not a promise, but something kind and dangerous wedged in between. They ask you to plant. Plant what? Ethan asked, and his voice cracked like the ice on the bucket when you tap it with the heel of your hand. The being extended a small capsule. Seth would have made a joke about seed vaults. Lyra would have said the word for hope in a voice that could handle it. Ethan took the capsule with a hand that had learned to hold and to let go without crushing. June cupped her mitten over his palm. They looked at each other and laughed breathless because the night was too big to stand all the way upright under it. They planted in spring. The capsule split like a chrysalis under soil. What came up looked like wheat and sunflowers had argued politely and then decided to share. The stalks made light at night, calling bees that were tired of listening to the arguments of street lamps. The heads bent toward sound. The grain tasted like snowmelt and honey, and the sharp bite at the back of your tongue when you kiss someone, and know it will ruin you forever and you are grateful. They ground it and made bread that healed nothing and made everything hurt less for an hour. People came from 2 counties. They brought jars and stories and one old radio that had stopped speaking a year ago and started again that afternoon as if it had heard a joke it wanted to tell. Ethan told the story as it grew. He told it to kids who came to see the glowing field, and to the elders who came with the suspicious look people get when they find they are happy to be wrong. He told it on the radio to a woman in Chile who had lost a brother to a sovereign net, and found his name spelled out in flowers later that year on a high plain by hands she never saw. He told it to himself when he could not sleep, and he learned to tell it without clenching his jaw. He made no heroes of himself. He put June in the center where she belonged. He spoke of Lyra and Seth as you speak of children who saved you from the ocean in a bucket, and then grew gills and went to live among the currents because they learned they were made of salt and wind. Summer leaned in the windows, sometimes his wife had washed, and the wind would lift the curtain and touch his shoulder, and he would say aloud to the empty kitchen, "We kept your blankets warm a while longer. We did as you taught." June would poke her head in and steal a slice of peach and roll her eyes affectionately. On a morning when the world was not burning, because sometimes the world is not burning and people forget to say it out loud, Ethan sat under the cottonwood at the yard's edge where the dog had claimed dominion, and he whittled because the small progress of knife through stick is a language a man can still speak when languages he used to speak have gone away. He heard the soft hum come again. It was not a sovereign hum. It was the sound grass makes in the throat right before you step into a meadow you are not sure you are allowed to step into. The light was small this time and shaped like an apology. It hovered over the prince and then over his face and then over the field, and then it went into the field and became nothing at all you could see. He slept later and dreamed of 2 children drawing a new map on the night with patient light. He woke with tears on his face and did not wipe them right away because sometimes you should let the body do its own washing. He got old enough that he could no longer pretend he would not die. He did not want to die. He had work and a daughter worth staying for and a field that glowed when it wanted to. But he knew. He put his papers in order. He taught boys how to fix fences, and he taught girls how to swear in the way that makes bad men leave you alone and good men laugh. He taught June the passwords to radios as if she did not already know them. He made a list of people who would come if she called, and when the list got too long, he laughed and burned it because a list like that is a different kind of weapon, and you do not leave weapons lying around. On the last summer he lived all the way. June took him in the truck to a hill north where the grass is short and the sky behaves like it is trying to be a lake. They sat in the truck bed with their backs against the cooler and their boots propped up on nothing, and the wind told them secrets it told everyone, and they pretended they were special. June pointed south where their house was a shrug in the distance. "You made a place," she said. "We did," he corrected gently. She nudged his shoulder with hers the way she had nudged his heart back into rhythm 100 times. "We will keep it," she said. "For them, for us." For a moment he saw again two small bodies wound in living rope, the fear in eyes that nonetheless met his and did not flinch, the silent scream when the sky learned their names. He saw his wife smiling and shaking her head and saying in a voice he could still hear in certain moods, "Of course you brought them home." He shut his eyes and let the wind fold him. When he finally went later, in a winter that did not overstay its welcome, June buried his ashes at the base of the cottonwood under a piece of old fence wire he had liked because it had a faithless bend. The town came. The valley came. The radio said goodbye in 3 languages and then in the language of static. The field glowed that night slower, like breathing. June sat on the porch with the dog, and with the kind of quiet that is not empty. She looked at the 2 prints and saw the frost hold them like delicate bones. In the years that followed, sovereign whispers came back like mold in corners, and the world did the always work of sweeping them and making new corners when the old ones were nice enough to stay clean. Children grew up hearing 2 stories, one about cities that learned to knit their own light into nets that turned sovereign mapping beams to gauze, and one about a small house where 2 children not born here lived for a while and left behind something that grew into bread that tastes like rain. People chose where to put their hands when they told these stories. Some put their hands on their hearts. Some put their hands on their mouths. Some put their hands on a friend's knee and squeezed once, twice, 3 times, a rhythm like truth. June stood sometimes in the field at night and listened for a note Seth might sneak out of the high sky and down into her waiting. She ran her palm across the heads of the glow grain and it bowed, and she bowed back. She learned to say no to men who wanted to write her story for her because they did not know how to read wheat. She learned to say yes to girls who wanted to learn how to move quietly through a field because they understood that moving quietly is sometimes the loudest thing. She kept a place at the table for travelers. She kept a cot near the stove made up. She kept water boiled because old habits are just memories wearing work clothes. One clear evening that had the exact weight of a memory, a streak crossed the horizon shallow as a skipped stone. June heard it before she saw it, not with ears but with that deeper instrument humans carry that hears babies cry 3 houses down and hears storms step on mountains. The streak slowed. It zigged, then zagged, then floated down like a feather hammered from light. It landed on the field where the 2 prints still showed faint even in green. It became a shape that was not like any sovereign shape. It became a door. It did not open right away. June stood very still. The dog lifted her head and then dropped it and went back to sleep because some stories are above a dog's pay grade. The door opened slow as a yawn you don't want to make because you are trying to listen. A figure stepped out. Tall. Shoulders a little narrow the way boys who turn into poets sometimes are. Behind them, a second figure shorter, shoulders like a dancer who has learned to turn grief into proof. They wore cloaks that shaded them from a sky that can be cruel to those who glowed too young. Their faces were not faces he had imagined, but June did not have to imagine. Her breath told her before her brain caught up. "Lyra," she said. The word cracked. She smiled at the crack. Seth laughed, and the laugh carried a note she remembered, the way a mother remembers the sound of a child's first cough and does not mix it with thunder. June, he said with joy that had 1,000 seasons and 1,000 blackouts and 1,000 birds in it. They did not run to each other because they had learned that reunions are delicate and large. They approached as if meeting again in a market they both knew and loved. They stood close. They parted. They looked at the field. They looked at the house. They looked at the sky. They placed palms together and then to their chests. June placed hers to theirs in turn and then to her own. No one in the field felt the need to teach anyone how to do it. The dog, after appropriate skepticism, came to sniff Lyra's fingers and then, satisfied, leaned her head against Seth's knee. Inside the house they sat near the stove because that was where things happen in houses. June poured water with hands that had done it since she was girl small, and Lyra watched the spiral of steam as if reading it. Seth touched the old radio and it sang a bar of an old song and then went quiet and then sang another bar. And June laughed helpless, because joy should embarrass you a little. They ate bread that lit their mouths and spoke not immediately of ships and hunts and calculations, but of June's corn that had come late and then stubborn, and of the river that had taken a bridge and then returned it piece by piece, because rivers are mercurial and sentimental both. Later they spoke of the sovereign in voices that did not give the enemy any flowers. Lyra spoke of a place between places where children are brought to be taught to forget. Seth spoke of threads of connections the sovereign cannot see because they do not believe anything is real that will not obey them. June spoke of the ground that learns the sound of a footstep and the sound of a tread and knows which to soften for and which to harden against. They did not use the word hope many times. They let the word rest while they worked around it. Before dawn they stood again in the field where the prince had been and where now new seedlings sprouted with a curious calm. Seth took June's hand and pressed it to the earth. Lyra splayed her fingers above their hands. The ground hummed in a key large enough to fit sorrow and honey. The horizon line lightened. The dog barked once at the pre-sun because someone has to. The children, no, not children now, but always the twins who had saved them by being brave while small, turned their heads toward the high sky as if hearing their names spoken by someone they loved. June felt the tug then, not of nets but of promises made to a future she could not live entirely in but could gladly send others to. They left again because what we love enough we often let go, but they did not leave everything. Lyra bent and touched the ground and a new symbol burned, faint and long, different from the first. Ethan would have understood it without pride, not running, not fighting, but staying. Seth put a small object by the porch, thin as a reed and humming a note so low you felt it only if you were very quiet. "Call," he said, and then he smiled a smile that made her want to build a bigger table. "Or don't, we'll come when the field asks." They went. The door closed, the sky accepted them, the prince remained, joined now by a long burn made by light and conscience. June watched the space where they had been and then turned toward the house. She had coffee to pour and a meeting at noon and a fence to mend. She had a new story to add to an old one, and she had the wisdom to add it without pretending to know the parts she had not seen. She whistled, and the dog ran ahead, flying on feet that could not fly and did not care. The years beyond the years we have already counted unfolded not smoothly, but with the great stubbornness of people who understand that endurance is passion with scar tissue. The sovereign continued to probe and taste and take when they found places where taking was cheap. Those places grew fewer. Humans, who had once built empires out of hurt, and then apologized in books later, learned to be small armies in kitchens and under cottonwoods and atop water towers with quilts thrown over their shoulders, because it was cold and you cannot fight well with cold knuckles. June grew into the shape Ethan had always told the truth about and sometimes lied to by omission when she needed it. She married someone quiet who could sharpen a hoe and a mind with equal care. They had a child who crawled straight and a child who never went anywhere straight because straight is a rumor, not a road. She taught them both the story and left out the parts children don't need until they ask. And then she gave those parts too, and trusted the wide sky over Kansas to hold their answers the way it had held her father's. When winds came hard, she went to the field, and the field answered in tones that made her feel less alone in her head. One cold twilight near the end of her life, when the field glowed gently as if thinking of summer on purpose, June sat on the porch her father had rebuilt after the first battle and held a blanket around her knees. She could feel the old scar of the world under her palm through the boards. A little boy from the neighbors drove up on a bike with only one brake and asked, breathless as if the question had been whole miles long, "Is it true? Did two space kids really save the world out here?" June looked at him, at the red nose and the open mouth and the certainty that he would love anything she told him because children do not pretend to be cynical until you teach them. She nodded gravely. "They did," she said. "They came tied and frightened and shining. We cut them free, they freed us back." The boy sat on the top step, eyes huge. Why'd they do it? June looked out at the field that had turned 1,000 seasons and at the two prints that winter still loves and at the long burn that writes staying and at the stars that listen when you stop pretending they don't. "Because we showed them the best of us," she said, "and they remembered the best of themselves." The boy chewed on that the way boys chew on the ends of sweaters. "Can I help?" he asked. June laughed softly and put a hand on his head. "You already are," she said, "every time you go home and tell this right." He pedaled away, wheels singing on gravel. June sat and let the quiet fill up like a bucket under a faucet, and when it brimmed, she tipped it gently over the memory of a man on a porch with a shotgun and a scar that only sometimes hurt, and over two children whose fear couldn't stop their kindness, and over a world that had learned. Slow, too slow, but learned. That heroism is often just a hand offered in the dark with the word no aimed in the right direction. A hum came when the edge of the night lifted its skirts to step aside for morning. It came not from ships and not from generators. It came from wheat and from bone and from the peace of the sky that belongs to people who plant. It threaded a sentence through the last shutters of her heart, and she spoke that sentence aloud to an empty yard because old women talk to empty yards all the time in the yards if they have been taught how answer. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.